Sweet. Hi, everyone. My name's Tom. I'm a general partner at Dragonfly. We're a global crypto venture fund. We've done a number of investments and sort of been writing about MEV for a while. We're early investors in Flashbots. And, I sort of want to walk through, I guess, maybe more of a VC's perspective on what's happening in the MEV space. I think there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of research put into how do we design fair, order flow auctions? How do we incentivize people to, extract MEV in a way that is like not malicious? And I think the mechanism design research that's been going on has been great. I think the problem, of course, is how do you make sure that the market recognizes maybe the outcome that we want, the mechanism that we want, and versus sort of having the market and sort of what the market decides be sort of suboptimal. And so when we started talking about is sort of the different actors that are circling on different parts of the MEV stack and how we might go about sort of preventing any single actor from maybe seizing a part that we don't really want them to. So I think so far, all this sort of discussion around MEV, all the research around MEV has been sort of related to sort of the world that we live in right now, where users sign a transaction, it hits the public mempool. Searchers, see these transactions, they assemble bundles, send them to a builder, and then eventually gets validated. And I think, unfortunately, like that sort of state of the world is slowly sort of changing over time. There's this really good tweet from Block Native where they basically try to drill down and figure out, what percentage of total transactions that we see actually aren't going through a public mempool. They're going through some other method that sort of breaks our mental model of the world, such as a private mempool that would sort of necessitate a change in how MEV and the MEV supply chain is being structured. And so we found it at 3.8%. This is older. I think it's actually much higher, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. And so the problem is like we can design really great auctions, but if we don't have incentives to encourage people to participate in the auctions, they kind of end up going to waste. And so this sort of gets back to this topic of like, block centralization and builder centralization. And actually, John has this really good flowchart talking about so the inherent centralization and sort of positive flywheel of private order flow. And I would argue this is already kind of happening already, as we'll get into a little bit. And I think so far, again, kind of the discussion in the MEV community has been sort of finger wagging. Oh, this is bad. Oh, we shouldn't, have private order flow. We shouldn't have this sort of centralization of builders. And instead, I like to sort of, think about it more in the sense of, well, how do we encourage and incentivize the people who maybe are privatizing order flow today to make it public and sort of get back to this sort of censorship resistant, decentralized open world that we want to sort of live in. And so this is very somewhat famously, classically, Stefan's MEV supply chain going from user to wallet to searcher to builder to validator. But I would argue this, again, is like almost too abstract. And this part right here is actually kind of where all the activity is happening right now in the MEV space. And one thing you might notice from the supply chain is that basically the further back you go in the supply chain, the more leverage that party has. So, the wallet actually has a lot more leverage over the searchers, and the user actually has a lot more leverage over the wallet. And so this isn't quite as simple as sort of how we think about transactions historically. And so to get into this, we'll sort of break down, classically, how does the transaction get formed? So you have some sort of UI. They send a signature request to the wallet, to the Web3 provider. The wallet then asks the user to sign. You get one of these little dudes. You click OK. The user sends the transaction. The wallet then sends this signed transaction to an RPC endpoint. And then that enters sort of this public mempool. It gets routed across all these different nodes. Eventually, either through the traditional means of just, validator finding it, including it in its block, or a searcher sending it to a builder and then getting it included in the box. It somehow gets validated, and then the dApp sort of updates its UI. But all these sort of different components of this life cycle, they all want to increasingly capture MEV for themselves And this flow sort of started to break down. And so, you have some memes that kind of describe, what's going on a little bit. We've got to get these out of the way, unfortunately. And so, there's a couple different camps here, and you can see why every different camp, every different stack, will sort of conceptualize why they actually think they deserve the order flow and why they're actually trying to go after it. So, I think right now, a lot of people think of order flow, they think of RPC providers. And there's been a lot of effort, a lot of development being put into having a sort of custom RPC provider, which we'll get into some examples in a little bit. I think in practice, this is like a really tough entry point for new companies and new projects. A lot of wallets won't even let you choose your default RPC provider. This was not the case for MetaMask until recently. It's super clunky. Users don't really understand what's going on. I think there's also even questions around how this actually monetized and how this actually gets paid. But in concept, one sort of way of entering the supply chain is basically, when the wallet actually sends the signed transaction to an RPC, I'm not just going to set it to sort of the conventional, ETH, mempool. I'm actually going to sort of replicate what that interface looks like and then do something kind of funky with the transaction. So one angle here is you sort of convince people to use your RPC because you sell them on some sort of security angle. So Heartbeat, which is a Dragonfly portfolio company, is going down this route. So you can send them all of your transactions. You can send your RPC to them. They intercept and scan every single transaction. And depending on the level of security that you choose with them, they can either ask you for a 2-FAC for every single transaction. So they'll email you or they'll text you and have you approve the transaction. Or if it's something that their simulation picks up as potentially, scammy or malicious, then only then will they actually, ask you for 2-FAC. And so it's sort of this nice little add-on or module into how people use RPC today, which is again just sort of you blast it into the mempool and sort of hope for the best. And I suspect this is kind of the path that like some of these other simulation tools are also kind of going to go down of basically, hey, I'm sort of like Norton Antivirus, send me all your transactions before they hit the public mempool. I'll make sure they look good, and then we'll sort of send them on. Another way to sort of think about this is RPCs that go after this sort of ease of use. So it's all these usability UX wins that in aggregate just make it strictly superior to just sending it to Infura or someone like that. So example would be GasHawk. They basically try to model out gas price fluctuation and then send your transaction when gas prices are lower and sort of save you money and sort of pocket some of the spread. It's even something like Flashbots Protect or the 1-inch rabbit hole. They wait to make sure that you're not paying for failed transactions. You can pay in arbitrary fees, etc. Both this and the previous category, in theory, should be strictly superior, and everybody should use them just using a standard Infura, for example, RPC endpoint. But for a lot of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, it's just really, really hard to get people to switch over if they can't even switch over at all. And so this sort of goes back to this other option, which is, well, instead of having users switch their RPC over, what if we just sell directly to wallets, right? Because wallets, again, they're further up the supply chain, they have more leverage, and then we'll integrate with them directly. So in concept, this is great for wallets, right? It's a new monetization path because you can sort of benefit from some of the MEV that your users are generating. You can outsource the MEV extraction to somebody else. So, maybe it's a bit simpler for you logistically or from an engineering perspective, or maybe, users are actually going to get some of the MEV directly as well, and sort of create stickiness. And so we're seeing some development down that path as well. But ultimately, this all is sort of, again, downwind of wallets. Wallets really have a lot of leverage over which RPC endpoint an order is going to get sent to or a transaction is going to get sent to. Wallets, obviously, they need to monetize. Not everyone can have sort of MetaMask swap style money printer. And so they're all looking for ways to sort of think about alternate sources of monetization. Wallets also have really great order flow. Not all order flow is created equal, right? Like order flow from a bot MEV or order flow that is toxic, order flow from a professional trader that might have some sort of alpha. That's not something where there might be that much MEV that you can extract. But if you're, catering to people who are less price sensitive, less time sensitive, that is actually order flow that can generate a lot of MEV, and therefore is pound for pound more valuable than other types of transactions that you see. So again, this is a sample from MetaMask where they're even starting to pursue this method of sort of swallowing up the RPC providers, and instead of having their own layer on top of them, where they can, again, provide a lot of these UX security benefits as well, but also potentially extract MEV. So before stuff even hits the public mempool, they can sort of do whatever they want with it. They can do it themselves. There's like a tweet interaction between Bert and Mike from Rainbow from a while ago, discussing the idea of, hey, what if Rainbow actually, just extracted MEV from user swaps itself, or partner with somebody else, or potentially auction it off, which is, I think, how a lot of people conceptualize it. The question is like, what reason do they have to do that? And how do you sort of make those economics actually work for wallets? You have to actually cater to them and sell them a product that they want because they have so much leverage in the ecosystem. I think the silver lining here is, I think wallets are actually finding that just charging on these sort of swap products is actually a much better monetization strategy than MEV extraction. And so it might just be that, they might sort of leave some juicy fruit sitting on the table instead of trying to, extract it themselves, because there's so many other ways for them to actually make money. Again, all the sort of discussion so far has been sort of presupposing the current sort of stack, right? Like the RPC providers sort of assume that users will be able to switch their RPC endpoint. And wallets are sort of assuming that, well, I will actually be able to receive transactions from users. And that, of course, is also changing over time, as we're seeing that like sort of the conventional way people sign and create orders is actually changing. So this whole sort of bit is kind of what I want to drill into a little bit. So dApps really kick off this whole process of the user clicks something or taps something on a UI, and then the dApp says, hey, wallet, please sign this transaction. But the transaction itself doesn't have to be a conventional Ethereum transaction. It can be an intent-based transaction, right? It can be like a OpenSea order or like a 0x order. Or this is the case from Sushi, where you're basically signing a hash that represents your intention. And then that doesn't even enter the wallet. Like there's no transaction to relay. That just goes back to the dApp. And then the dApp can do whatever they want with it. So in this scenario, Sushi has a partnership with Manifold, where they have this product called Sushi Guard, where basically when you swap on Sushi, you sign this intent. It goes to Sushi Guard. They can extract MEV from it. And then that can go back to Sushi. So the wallet doesn't even actually see the transaction in this flow. And therefore, the RPC providers don't even see this transaction. I think this is kind of not optimal because it's really confusing for users. You don't really know what you're signing. You're signing this hex, which can obviously, as we've seen with sort of the permit style attacks and other types of attacks, actually be malicious in some scenarios. So people have been sort of conditioned to be on guard when they're signing a transaction, less so when they're signing a message. But a message can, given certain conditions, also be kind of malicious. And of course, this also sort of depends on the dApp. A lot of dApps. I mean, we're talking about the protocol layer as well as maybe the UI layer. It really depends on what percentage of your volume or percentage of your activity is going through your first-party interface or versus third-party interfaces. So if the majority of your volume is going through an aggregator or a third-party or maybe just bots, you probably don't actually have that much leverage in terms of how do transactions actually get generated. Whereas if you have a great site, or maybe you are slowly vertically integrating and creating your own wallet or creating your own app, you actually have a lot more leverage in terms of again, choosing where orders are being routed and sort of where order flow is being generated. So this is like a screenshot from Thicky Thought, who's one of the founders of Friction, basically looking at the percentage of toxic order flow on Uniswap, which you can think of as sort of a rough proxy for the percent of volume that's going through or not going through the Uniswap UI and instead being generated programmatically or going through some sort of third party. So I think, zooming out a little bit, all this is to say that the sort of the land underneath MEV world is shifting pretty rapidly. And so, building a product that assumes that people will be able to find a transaction in a public mempool and then, engage in some sort of searching process for it, I think is not probably going to be long for this world. So the question is, how do we make it EV positive for these different players to cooperate and participate in an open auction that is fair to users, as opposed to relying on their benevolence to not generate malicious MEV, not self-extract. You don't really want a world where the majority of transactions are going through MetaMask MetaMask does self-extraction, and then they also maybe become a builder, and it becomes all vertically integrated, which is kind of the trend that we're seeing. I think there's also a question of like, where will that MEV actually end up? Obviously, everybody's trying to go after it, but there's also a question of, why doesn't this end up with users? There are efforts to push the MEV that is being generated back to users versus going back to an RPC endpoint, going back to a wallet, or going back to a dApp. But I think that ultimately relies on competitive pressures across these different players to do so. No one would willingly do it, but it's sort of like credit card points, where if everybody else is giving some sort of kickback, you're sort of forced to do so as well, even though it sort of hurts your bottom line. And then I have a research piece coming out soon that sort of has more data on trying to map out and quantify the public mempool or the private mempool problem. But if you want to collaborate, feel free to DM or email me. But I think in my mind, we're sort of in a state similar where we were maybe 2 years ago before MEV Explore, where we know there's a problem and we have some sort of little snippets, through different papers or through one-off research pieces, but we don't really continuously monitor this or track this. And, based on some of the anecdotes as well as some initial data, it seems like it's a growing problem if we want to live in a world where, all transactions are just going through a private mempool effectively. So ultimately, I think when we sort of look ahead, the big takeaway here is the people further up the supply chain have more power. And so naturally, everybody is trying to move further up. But it's tricky given some interests are sort of already entrenched. And so, everybody's acting really rationally. Nobody is trying to be malicious here. And so we can't just really finger wag and say, hey, you should not be privatizing order flow. You should not be self-extracting. Instead, we should make it economically reasonable and rational for them to give up their order flow and participate in an open auction. And I think that's where I'd like to see more sort of discussion happening versus just sort of assuming that it will happen. I think things like MEV Share are a great step, and obviously making more accessible for people to participate in an open auction. But I think ultimately the question we need to make sure we're answering is whether or not it makes sense for these different actors to open up order flow to an open auction versus, again, sort of keeping it private. So that was it. I kept it kind of quick. Happy to answer any questions if people have them. Actually, I realize I don't even have, I had to close the tab so I don't get echo, but happy to answer questions.
We are running a bit on,
or to the time. That's right. I was
we're still behind on time. So we are just going to move over to Quintus. But thank you, the viewers who are confused by Tarun's equations. Appreciated the break on this one. And we will turn it over to Quintus now, who's going to talk about cats, I think.